Beneath the silhouette of a pagoda, as morning fog lifts from the slopes of Mount Fuji, a distant temple bell echoes through the quiet air. The cherry blossoms drip like snow over stone pots walked by shoguns, monks, and emperors. Here, in this chain of islands rising from the Pacific, time moves like water flowing gently, reshaping everything it touches, yet leaving the past always just beneath the surface. This is Japan, a land of contradiction and continuity, where the sword met the brush, where isolation nurtured innovation, and where tradition walks side by side with the future. But Japan did not always look this way. To know its heart, we must travel back beyond bullet trains and neon skylines, past warlords and emperors, to a time before even the first rice fields were sown, over thousands of years. Japan would transform from a land of scattered tribal communities to one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth. It would birth samurai and poets, forge one of the most disciplined militaries in history, and endure the fires of total war and atomic devastation, only to rise again as a global power built on peace and precision. But how did it happen? How did Japan become what it is today? In this film, we journey through the full sweep of Japanese history, patiently, thoroughly, and quietly tracing its roots from the Jōmon forest to the Tokyo skyline. Along the way, we'll meet emperors who ruled in shadows, peasants who became generals, and artists whose work outlived empires. From myth to modernity, this is the entire history of Japan, one story, many centuries, and a legacy that still shapes the world.
Before the rise of shoguns and samurai, before emperors sat on thrones of divine descent, Japan was a land of forests, mountains, and stone tools. The story of Japanese civilization begins in deep prehistory, some 30,000 years ago, when Paleolithic hunter-gatherers first crossed land bridges from the Asian mainland into what would become the Japanese archipelago. These early peoples hunted mammoths and deer, crafted stone blades, and left behind the earliest known traces of human life on these islands. But it is the Jōmon period, beginning around 14,000 BC, that marks the true cultural dawn of Japan, named for the cord-marked pottery they left behind. The Jōmon people developed one of the world's oldest known ceramic traditions. Thousands of years before pottery appeared in Mesopotamia or Egypt, they lived in small villages, hunted with bows, fished from dugout canoes, and revered the natural world through ritual and totem. Despite being pre-agricultural, the Jōmon lived in settled communities for millennia, evolving a complex culture rooted in harmony with nature. Their pottery, striking, often fantastically ornate, speaks of a worldview both spiritual and artistic, a glimpse into a Japan untouched by war or empire. Around 300 BCE, a dramatic shift occurred. New people began arriving from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them rice agriculture, bronze tools, and iron weapons. This marked the start of the Yayoi period, and with it, Japan began to change. Villages grew into organized societies. Wet rice cultivation transformed the land and population. Social hierarchies emerged, and conflict between clans became more common. The Yayoi people are seen by many historians as the foundational ancestors of modern Japanese, both genetically and culturally. Their legacy lies not only in agriculture and metallurgy, but in the very shape of Japan's early state. By the 3rd century CE, Chinese records mention a powerful kingdom in Japan ruled by a queen named Himiko, a shaman ruler who governed through ritual and diplomacy. Her realm, called Yamato, may have been the forerunner of what would soon become Japan's first imperial line. As the early cultures expanded and intermingled, they gave rise to the Kofun period, named after their massive burial mounds, some keyhole-shaped constructed for powerful rulers. These tombs, like silent islands in the landscape, signaled the rise of elite warrior kings and centralized authority. It was during this era, around the 4th and 5th centuries, that the Yamato clan emerged as dominant, claiming descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu and establishing a divine lineage that remarkably still exists today. The Japanese emperor remains the oldest continuing hereditary monarchy in the world, a living echo of these ancient myths. Thus, Japan's prehistoric dawn was not marked by a single moment, but by a slow unfolding of nature into ritual, of clan into kingdom, of island into nation. The Jōmon had given Japan its heart, the Yayoi its backbone, and the Yamato its identity. And though much would change, the memory of these ancient times, the reverence for nature, the rhythm of rice, the aura of ancestry, would ripple forward, shaping the Japan to come.
By the 6th century CE, the Yamato clan had established itself as the paramount power in the Japanese archipelago, claiming divine authority through descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. But rulership in early Japan was not absolute in the modern sense. It was ceremonial, spiritual, and deeply intertwined with Shinto ritual. Still, the Yamato court steadily extended its influence through military strength, diplomatic alliances, and religious consolidation. One of the most profound changes of this time came not by the sword, but by the scroll. The introduction of Buddhism, which arrived from the Korean kingdom of Baekje around the mid-6th century. This foreign religion sparked both fascination and conflict. Some clans, like the powerful Soga, embraced its teachings and art, seeing it as a path to political legitimacy and cultural prestige. Others, such as the Mononobe, resisted, fearing the wrath of native kami and the erosion of traditional beliefs. Eventually, Buddhism gained imperial favor, thanks in large part to Prince Shotoku, a brilliant statesman and scholar who served as regent in the early 7th century. Shotoku championed Buddhist values, opened relations with the Chinese Sui dynasty, and promulgated Japan's first moral and political code, often called the 17-Article Constitution. Though more ethical guideline than legal document, it reflected a Confucian Buddhist vision of statecraft, emphasizing harmony, hierarchy, and reverence for imperial authority. Under his influence, the Japanese court began modeling itself after the sophisticated bureaucracy of Tang China, importing writing systems, legal frameworks, religious institutions, and artistic styles. The goal was clear: to build a centralized state with the emperor at its sacred core. This vision took physical form in 710, when the imperial capital was moved to Nara, a city laid out in a precise grid modeled after Chang'an, the Tang capital. Nara became Japan's first true city, a place of temples, scrolls, and ceremonial processions. It was here that the Japanese began compiling their early histories, myths, and laws, producing works like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which fused mythology with record-keeping to legitimize imperial rule. In these texts, emperors traced their lineage back to the gods, while accounts of conquest and diplomacy were stylized into epic chronicles. Meanwhile, great Buddhist temples such as Todaiji rose above the city, their bronze Buddhas and wooden halls symbols of a state where religion and governance were deeply entwined. But even as the court reached new heights of sophistication, power remained precarious. The Nara court was burdened by growing aristocratic factions, especially powerful families like the Fujiwara, who began to dominate court politics. Concerned with the rising influence of Buddhist monasteries near the capital, the court decided to move again to a new location called Heian-kyo, now known as Kyoto. The Heian period, beginning in 794, would last nearly 4 centuries and become one of the most iconic eras in Japanese cultural memory. The Heian period was not an age of warlords or conquest. It was an era of courtly elegance, where aristocrats communicated through poetry, dressed in elaborate silk robes, and followed intricate rituals of propriety. The imperial court became a world unto itself, insulated from the provinces, steeped in the aesthetics of fleeting beauty and melancholy grace. This refined culture reached its zenith in the 11th century with the Tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu. Often considered the world's first novel, it told the story of a handsome prince and his romantic entanglements within the rigid confines of Heian society. Behind its gentle surface, Genji reveals a world where social status governed every gesture and emotions were carefully veiled behind layers of poetry. The Heian aristocracy lived in a dreamlike realm, detached from the common people and rural realities, but their cultural legacy would echo through Japanese art, literature, and sensibility for centuries. Yet beneath the still waters of court life, tectonic forces were shifting. The imperial court, fixated on ceremony and intrigue, gradually ceded control over the countryside to provincial noblemen and military families. To maintain order in distant provinces, the court had delegated authority to regional warriors known as samurai, servants who would soon become masters. Powerful clans like the Taira and Minamoto began building independent power bases, often through martial strength, landholding, and patronage of local temples. These warrior aristocrats upheld ideals of loyalty and martial virtue, but they also brought violence and ambition. By the 12th century, Japan stood at a crossroads. The delicate world of court poetry and ritual was giving way to a more brutal, dynamic age, an age of armor, swords, and rising warlords. The capital remained a place of beauty, but the provinces now echoed with the gallop of horses and the clash of blades. The Heian period had nurtured Japan's cultural soul, giving birth to its literature, aesthetics, and aristocratic traditions. But it had also sown the seeds of its own eclipse. As the emperor retreated into ritual, real power migrated to those who could command loyalty, land, and steel. The sun had not set on imperial Japan, but it now rose for the warrior. The era of the samurai had begun. By the close of the 12th century, Japan had transformed from a realm of refined courtly ritual to a fractured land of rising military power, and the samurai, once provincial enforcers, were now at the center of political life. The tipping point came with the Genpei War, 1180-1185, a brutal civil conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans, two great warrior families who had risen through the ranks of court service and military command. The war ended with the catastrophic defeat of the Taira at the Battle of Dan no Ura, a sea battle that has passed into legend for its tragic heroism and haunting images of young nobles, including the child emperor Antoku, cast into the sea to avoid capture. Victory placed Minamoto no Yoritomo at the helm of power, and in 1192 he was granted the title of Shogun, military commander by the emperor. But this was no ordinary military rank. It marked the beginning of a new system of governance known as the Bakufu, or Shogunate. While the emperor remained in Kyoto as a divine figurehead, real authority now rested with the shogun and his warrior government based in Kamakura. Thus, Japan entered the Kamakura period, 1185-1333, the first true age of feudalism, where loyalty, land, and martial service defined the social order. The samurai class, originally just mounted warriors, developed into a distinct aristocracy bound by the code of Bushido, a set of ideals emphasizing loyalty, honor, discipline, and the acceptance of death. They wore distinctive armor, carried two swords, the katana and wakizashi, and trained in archery, horseback riding, and later swordsmanship. But the early Kamakura shogunate was far from peaceful. It faced constant threats from rival clans, natural disasters, and in the late 13th century, one of the greatest invasions in Japanese history, the arrival of the Mongols. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire, already the largest land empire the world had ever seen, demanded submission from Japan. When the Kamakura Bakufu refused, Mongol fleets were launched in 1274 and again in 1281. The first invasion was fierce and introduced new weapons like gunpowder bombs, but was ultimately thwarted by fierce resistance and a timely storm. The second invasion, far larger, ended in disaster when a massive typhoon destroyed much of the Mongol fleet. The Japanese would call it the kamikaze, or divine wind, interpreting it as heaven's protection of the sacred islands. But the cost of defense nearly bankrupted the shogunate, which struggled to reward its warriors with land or spoils, leading to rising discontent among the samurai class. Eventually, the Kamakura regime collapsed in 1333, and a brief period of imperial revival under Emperor Go-Daigo followed. But this restoration was short-lived. Power quickly fell into the hands of Ashikaga Takauji, a former loyal general who turned against the court and founded a new military regime, the Ashikaga Shogunate, headquartered in Kyoto's Muramachi district. This era, known as the Muromachi period, 1336-1573, was marked by cultural flourishing but also deepening political instability. The Ashikaga shoguns were weaker than their Kamakura predecessors and often relied on shifting alliances with powerful regional lords known as daimyo. Over time, these daimyo became nearly autonomous rulers of their domains, maintaining private armies, building castles, and pursuing their own ambitions. As central authority eroded, Japan descended into a century of near-constant civil war known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. This was a time of intrigue, betrayal, sieges, and famous battles. Samurai warlords like Uesugi Kenshin, Takeda Shingen, and Date Masamune carved out domains through blood and fire, while the common people suffered under the weight of shifting allegiances and ceaseless conflict. Amid this chaos rose one of Japan's most enigmatic and ambitious figures, Oda Nobunaga. A ruthless and innovative warlord, Nobunaga used firearms introduced by Portuguese traders, matchlock muskets known as Tanegashima, to revolutionize battlefield tactics. In 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, he decimated the cavalry of Takeda Katsuyori using disciplined lines of gunners protected by wooden stockades. But Nobunaga's ambitions extended beyond military domination. He sought to unify Japan and break the power of entrenched institutions like militant Buddhist sects. He famously destroyed the warrior monks of Mount Hiei, shocking even his allies. Yet his brutal methods and growing power led to betrayal. In 1582, one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned on him, forcing Nobunaga to commit suicide in Kyoto's Honnoji Temple. His legacy, however, was carried on by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a brilliant peasant-born general who avenged Nobunaga, defeated rival daimyo, and completed the unification of Japan. Hideyoshi, though born in poverty, rose to become Kampaku, or imperial regent, and imposed sweeping reforms to solidify control. He conducted massive land surveys, restricted weapon ownership to the samurai class, and froze social mobility by forbidding peasants from becoming warriors. These changes solidified the class structure that would define early modern Japan. But Hideyoshi's ambition did not stop at unification. He launched a disastrous invasion of Korea in 1592, aiming to conquer China. Despite initial successes, the campaign bogged down against fierce Korean and Ming Chinese resistance, and Hideyoshi died before it concluded. His death left a power vacuum, setting the stage for the final act of samurai consolidation, the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1600, Ieyasu crushed his rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara, establishing unchallenged dominance over the land. 3 years later, he was granted the title of Shogun, founding the Tokugawa Shogunate, a regime that would rule Japan for over 250 years. The Tokugawa era marked the end of the feudal wars and the beginning of a new age, one of peace, order, and isolation. But that peace was hard-won, built upon centuries of bloodshed, ambition, and transformation. The samurai had gone from provincial enforcers to the ruling class of a unified nation. And while the age of the sword was far from over, a new challenge now awaited Japan. Not the sword, but the scroll. Not conquest, but control. With the founding of the Tokugawa Shogunate in 1603, Japan entered one of the most remarkable periods in its history. Over 2.5 centuries of relative peace, stability, and seclusion from the outside world. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the victor of Sekigahara and founder of the new order, established his government in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, while the emperor remained a sacred, symbolic figure in distant Kyoto. But unlike previous regimes, the Tokugawa Bakufu succeeded not through sheer force, but through a sophisticated system of control that balanced power between the central authority and the semi-autonomous daimyo, or feudal lords. The Tokugawa implemented the Bakuhan system, a dual structure of government in which the shogunate held national authority, while local domains governed themselves, provided they pledged loyalty and obeyed strict laws. To prevent rebellion, the Tokugawa enforced a policy known as Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance, which required daimyo to spend every other year in Edo and leave their families behind as hostages when they returned home. This policy drained the resources of the daimyo, kept them under surveillance, and tied them economically and emotionally to the shogunate. Over time, it transformed Edo into a bustling metropolis and cultural hub. By the 18th century, it was one of the largest cities in the world. To maintain this peace, the Tokugawa regime strictly regulated social order. Japanese society was divided into rigid classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, in that descending order of prestige, though ironically, the merchants often became the wealthiest over time. Samurai, once warriors, became bureaucrats and administrators, living on fixed stipends. Peasants were forbidden to leave the land, artisans practiced their trades in castle towns, and merchants, though looked down upon, ran the economic machinery of the realm. This social immobility was designed to prevent unrest and solidify Tokugawa authority, but it also created tension, as economic realities often clashed with traditional values. To maintain ideological control, the shogunate embraced Neo, Confucianism, as the official doctrine, emphasizing hierarchy, loyalty, and moral duty. Education flourished, with the rise of terracotta or temple schools, spreading literacy among commoners. A literate population, rare in the world at the time, gave birth to a vibrant culture of printing, poetry, theater, and philosophy. The rigid structure of the Tokugawa era gave Japan not just peace, but a cultural renaissance. Yet perhaps the most defining feature of the Tokugawa era was its policy of sakoku, the closed country policy. From the 1630s onward, the shogunate expelled nearly all foreigners, banned Japanese from traveling abroad, and forbade Christianity, which it saw as a threat to social order and loyalty. European missionaries were expelled or executed, and those who practiced Christianity in secret, kakure kirishitan, or hidden Christians, faced persecution. The only foreigners allowed limited access were the Dutch, confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. Even then, their interactions were tightly controlled and restricted to trade. This policy of seclusion wasn't total isolation. Japan maintained contact with Korea, the Ryukyu Kingdom, and the Ainu in the north, but it insulated Japan from the waves of European colonization and global commerce that transformed much of Asia. For over 2 centuries, Japan remained culturally independent, politically stable, and economically self-sufficient. In an age when many societies were fractured by war or bent under foreign rule, Japan became an island of tranquility. Still, the peace came at a cost. The samurai class, no longer needed in battle, grew restless and indebted. Peasants, burdened by taxes and crop failures, erupted in periodic rebellions. Famine, inflation, and corruption chipped away at the shogunate's authority, especially during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Reformers attempted to modernize the system from within, but change was resisted by those invested in the status quo. Meanwhile, outside forces were drawing near. In 1853, the illusion of seclusion shattered with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships from the United States. Perry demanded that Japan open its ports to American trade, and the shogunate, recognizing its military inferiority, reluctantly signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. Other Western powers soon followed, extracting similar unequal treaties. Japan's sovereignty had been breached, and its people were awakened to the peril of their outdated systems. The arrival of the West set off a political and ideological earthquake. Many saw the shogunate as weak and corrupt, incapable of defending Japan's honor. Discontent surged among both samurai and commoners. A movement grew to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, a call to restore power to the imperial court and resist foreign influence. Assassinations, riots, and civil strife followed, culminating in the collapse of the Tokugawa regime in 1868. After more than 260 years of rule, the shogunate had fallen. The emperor was restored to political power in what came to be known as the Meiji Restoration. But the Japan that emerged from the Tokugawa period was not broken. It was prepared. Its long peace had preserved its culture, its identity, and its unity. And now, as the modern world closed in, Japan would not be conquered. It would evolve with astonishing speed and purpose into a power of its own. In the year 1868, as cherry blossoms drifted softly through the spring air and the ancient capital of Kyoto stirred with rumor and ceremony, a young emperor named Meiji ascended to power not as a ceremonial figurehead in a feudal machine, but as the living symbol of a new Japan. At just 15 years old, he would preside over one of the most breathtaking national transformations in human history, an era that would see Japan break with centuries of isolation and tradition to rise within mere decades into the ranks of the world's great powers. This was the Meiji Restoration, a revolution not in blood and guillotines like France, but in institutions, in imagination, and in steel. After the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, power was restored to the imperial throne, at least in theory, but real authority lay with the visionary oligarchs and reformers surrounding the young emperor. Men like Okubo Toshimichi, Saigo Takamori, and Ito Hirobumi, many of whom had once been samurai, but now saw the way forward not in swords, but in railroads and rifles. They had watched with alarm as the West carved up China, as British gunboats dominated rivers, and as American traders demanded access to Japan's ports under threat of force. They understood with ruthless clarity that Japan must modernize or be colonized, and so the country was remade at an astonishing pace. The feudal Han were abolished, replaced by centralized prefectures. A national conscript army was created, modeled after Prussia's. Samurai privileges were dismantled. A new tax system was introduced. Railways stretched like veins across the islands. Telegraph wires hummed with messages. Western dress and manners became fashionable in Tokyo and Osaka. Japanese students were sent abroad to study law, science, engineering, and military tactics. Foreign experts, engineers from Germany, naval architects from Britain, teachers from the United States, were invited to Japan in droves, helping to reshape everything from universities to shipyards. And yet, amid all this change, Japan did not lose itself. Shinto was elevated as a national ideology, the emperor became a sacred unifying figure, and traditional arts continued to flourish alongside factories and ministries. The transformation reached its political peak in 1889 with the promulgation of the Meiji Constitution. Modeled after the Prussian system, it established a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature, the Diet, but retained ultimate sovereignty in the emperor. It was a carefully balanced hybrid of Western form and Japanese authority. And the new Japan was not content to merely modernize internally. It now looked outward, eager to prove its strength on the world stage. In 1894, Japan went to war with China over influence in Korea, a conflict that had once been unthinkable, but now ended with a shocking Japanese victory. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan and recognize Korea's independence, while also paying a massive indemnity. This moment announced Japan's arrival as a modern imperial power. But recognition by the West was not yet complete. The Triple Intervention, by Russia, France, and Germany, forced Japan to give up part of its gains, igniting a deep resentment that would smolder for decades. In response, Japan doubled down. Its navy was expanded, modernized, and built around British designs. Its army studied the German model even more closely. Industrial capacity soared, with zaibatsu conglomerates like Mitsubishi and Mitsui driving economic growth. Education became compulsory. Literacy rates climbed. A new national identity emerged. Fiercely independent, technically adept and burning with pride. The ultimate test came in 1904, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Russian forces in Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War was not only a military conflict, it was a clash of world views, East against West, colonized against colonizer, and Japan won. At sea, Admiral Togo's fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Squadron in the Battle of Tsushima, one of the most decisive naval battles in history. On land, Japanese forces endured horrendous losses but pushed Russian armies back across the Asian continent. The 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, recognized Japan's interests in Korea and handed over southern Sakhalin. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a major European empire. The world was stunned. In colonies from India to Vietnam, revolutionaries took note. Japan had shown what could be done. But with triumph came consequences. Having tasted empire, Japan hungered for more. Korea was formally annexed in 1910. Military expansionists began to exert more influence. And while Meiji himself died in 1912, his legacy endured, a Japan that had remade itself on its own terms, balancing East and West, tradition and innovation, hierarchy and ambition. Yet beneath the glittering surface of success lay tensions. The dismantling of the samurai class had left many disaffected. Rapid industrialization created urban poverty and labor unrest. The rural poor often bore the brunt of taxes and conscription. Nationalism, once a force of unity, began to curdle into militarism. The Meiji Restoration had been a gamble, a bold attempt to control change rather than be destroyed by it. For half a century, it worked brilliantly. But in the decades to come, the very tools of power and industry that had saved Japan would be turned toward darker ends. And the empire that had once risen to inspire the world would soon stand on the brink of global conflict. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had no choice but to recognize a new power rising in the East. Japan, once an isolated archipelago ruled by samurai and shoguns, had transformed with astonishing speed into a modern industrial nation. The Meiji Restoration had awakened the nation, but it was not content with modernization alone. Japan was now hungry for recognition, for territory, for empire. It had outgrown the small islands that birthed it. Now, the Empire of Japan turned its gaze outward toward Asia and beyond, eager to claim its place on the world stage, not as a student of the West, but as its equal. The rise of Japanese imperialism was not an accident of history. It was deliberate, strategic, and driven by survival. In a world dominated by Western colonial powers, Japan feared being swallowed rather than respected. European empires had carved up China, India, and Southeast Asia. America had reached across the Pacific. Japan, lacking natural resources, viewed expansion as a matter of national security. If it did not become an empire, it would become a colony. That fear would shape its path toward global conflict. Japan's first test came in 1894, when it went to war with China over control of Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War was brief but decisive. Japan's modern army and navy crushed Qing forces, shocking observers worldwide. The Treaty of Shimonoseki gave Japan its first colonial prize, Taiwan, along with influence over Korea. But Japan's triumph was short-lived. Russia, France, and Germany quickly forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula in a move known as the Triple Intervention, humiliating the Japanese government. The lesson was clear: military victory was not enough. Japan needed diplomatic clout and greater power to stand up to the Western empires. That resentment simmered beneath the surface, and it would not be forgotten. Just a decade later, Japan would have its revenge, not against China, but against Russia. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was a turning point in global history. It was the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire in a major modern war. Japan's victory stunned the world and electrified anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. At sea, the Japanese Navy decimated the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait. On land, they fought brutal battles across Manchuria. The war's end confirmed Japan as a great power. But with victory came confidence and ambition. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, beginning a brutal and controversial colonial rule that would last 35 years. Korean language, culture, and identity were suppressed. Resistance was met with violence. Yet in Japan, this was seen as a triumph of civilization, a belief in Japan's divine destiny to lead Asia. This ideology, often called Pan-Asianism, framed Japanese imperialism not as conquest, but liberation from Western dominance. Japan would become the guardian of Asia, but it would do so on its own terms. During World War I, Japan joined the Allies and seized German holdings in China and the Pacific. At the Treaty of Versailles, it walked away with new territories, but not with equal respect. Japan had proposed a racial equality clause for the League of Nations, only to have it rejected by Western powers. Once again, Japan was reminded that to the West, it remained other. Pride wounded, the seeds of resentment deepened. The 1920s were a paradox. Internally, Japan experienced a brief flowering of democracy, the so-called Taisho democracy. Political parties gained influence. Women began to organize. Culture blossomed in cities like Tokyo and Osaka. Western fashions, jazz music, and cinema flourished. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Economic inequality, inflation, and rural suffering intensified. The 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, which leveled Tokyo and Yokohama and killed over 100,000 people, added to the national trauma. Political assassinations became more frequent. Ultra-nationalist groups gained followers. The military, increasingly autonomous from civilian government, saw itself as the true guardian of the nation's soul. And with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, everything changed. Japan's economy collapsed. International trade evaporated. Millions were thrown into poverty. Many in Japan blamed the West, blaming capitalism, foreign dependence, and weak civilian leadership. Into this vacuum, the military stepped forward. Officers, especially from the imperial army, began to exert more direct control over policy. Politicians were intimidated or assassinated. Censorship increased. A new era of militarism had begun, one that saw Japan's destiny not in cooperation, but conquest. In 1931, without approval from Tokyo, rogue elements of the army staged the Mukden Incident, a manufactured attack used to justify the invasion of Manchuria in northeastern China. The region was rich in resources, and Japan quickly established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing the last Qing emperor Puyi as its figurehead. The world condemned the move. The League of Nations called it illegal. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League entirely, turning further inward, further defiant. The conquest of Manchuria was just the beginning. In 1937, war exploded across China in full. The Second Sino-Japanese War began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident and escalated into a brutal, grinding conflict that would last 8 years. Japanese troops captured Shanghai, then Nanjing, where they committed one of the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century, the Nanjing Massacre. Tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. Women were raped and mutilated. The international community watched in horror. But Japan's military leadership pressed on, convinced that only total domination of East Asia could secure Japan's survival. By 1940, Japan controlled much of eastern China, and its expansion continued into French Indochina. Seeking to secure oil, rubber, and other vital resources, Japan prepared for broader conquest. In 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, an alliance that placed Japan at the heart of the Axis powers. At home, the government fell fully under military control. Civil liberties vanished. Propaganda saturated society. Schools taught children that they were subjects of a divine emperor and that Japan was destined to rule Asia. The cult of Emperor Hirohito was elevated to near-religious levels, though real power lay increasingly with generals like Hideki Tojo. A totalitarian state emerged, cloaked in national pride and bound to the sword. Yet the one obstacle Japan had not yet removed was the United States. The U.S. had grown increasingly alarmed by Japan's actions in China and Southeast Asia. In response, it imposed economic sanctions and froze Japanese assets. Most devastatingly, it cut off Japan's access to oil, a resource the empire desperately needed to sustain its military machine. Faced with what it saw as an existential threat, Japan made a fateful decision. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Battleships burned in the harbor. The Pacific War had begun. Japan's empire surged outward in a lightning wave. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all fell in rapid succession. For a moment, the rising sun flew over vast swaths of Asia and the Pacific. But the tide would not hold. The empire had risen high, but it had risen too far, too fast. That story of resistance, ruin, and rebirth belongs to the next chapter. For now, as the sun sets over the Pacific and the world braces for total war, Japan stands at its imperial zenith, powerful, proud, and poised on the brink of catastrophe. In the quiet of a Pacific dawn on December 7, 1941, as the sun rose over the waters of Oahu, the stillness was shattered by a roar. Japanese aircraft, over 350 of them, descended on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, launching a surprise attack that would change the world. In less than 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet was devastated. Battleships sunk, aircraft destroyed, over 2,400 lives lost. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States in turn. The global conflict that had begun in Europe now stretched across the Pacific. The Second World War had become truly worldwide, and Japan was at its heart. But to understand how Japan reached this moment of fiery aggression, we must look back through the previous decade. The 1930s saw a surge in militarism within Japan. Civilians had been gradually pushed out of power, and military leaders increasingly dictated both foreign and domestic policy. Nationalist fervor was stoked in schools and media. The emperor, once a symbol, became a living god in the eyes of the people. In 1931, Japan staged the Mukden incident as a pretext to invade Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the move. Japan withdrew from the League in defiance. International agreements that once held Japan in diplomatic check, like the Washington Naval Treaty, were dismissed. The path toward war had already begun. By 1937, war erupted with China in full force. The Second Sino-Japanese War was brutal and prolonged. Japanese forces committed horrific atrocities, most notoriously the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed and tens of thousands of women raped in a spree of violence. As the war in China dragged on, Japan found itself in need of resources, especially oil, rubber, and metals. Yet the Western colonial powers controlled these vital materials in Southeast Asia. Thus, the military leadership resolved, Japan must take control of these territories to sustain its empire and war effort. In July 1941, Japan occupied French Indochina. The United States, in response, froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo. Deprived of vital fuel, Japan faced a choice: withdraw from China and lose face and imperial ambition, or strike preemptively before supplies ran out. And so came Pearl Harbor. While successful as a tactical surprise, it was a strategic miscalculation. The attack unified American public opinion overnight. Within months, U.S. industrial might began converting into tanks, aircraft, ships, and supplies at a pace Japan could never match. Japan rapidly expanded across the Pacific, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. But the victories would not last. The tide turned in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway, when the United States sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. From that moment on, Japan was on the defensive. The following years were marked by a war of attrition across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. Island by island, the United States and its allies pushed Japan back. The fighting grew ever more desperate. Japanese troops refused to surrender, fighting to the death, often in banzai charges. Civilians in occupied areas, including Okinawa, were told that capture meant death. This militarized culture of death culminated in kamikaze attacks, pilots flying suicide missions to sink enemy ships. The Japanese homeland braced for invasion, with every man, woman, and child expected to resist to the last. But the end came not through invasion, but from the sky. In March 1945, the United States firebombed Tokyo, killing over 100,000 people in one night, more than would die in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Cities across Japan were reduced to ashes in nightly bombing raids. Yet still, Japan refused to surrender. Then, on August 6, 1945, the American B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In an instant, tens of thousands perished. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Between the two blasts, well over 100,000 lives were lost. Even then, Japan's leadership hesitated. Some military leaders argued to fight on. But on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to his people for the first time in a historic radio broadcast. He called for surrender, stating, in solemn and poetic terms, that Japan must endure the unendurable. For the first time in its history, Japan had lost a war. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. World War II had come to an end. Japan lay in ruins, its cities bombed out, its economy shattered, its empire gone. Over 3 million Japanese had died in the conflict, and the once divine emperor stood humbled in the eyes of the world. But even in defeat, seeds of rebirth were being planted. Japan's next chapter, under occupation, under reform, would transform it from empire to democracy, from ashes to industry, from militarist power to peaceful prosperity. In August 1945, the land of the rising sun stood in ruins. Japan's cities were firebombed, its economy shattered, and its people starving amid the smoldering debris of what had once been a mighty empire. Over 60 cities were reduced to ashes, including Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had vanished beneath mushroom clouds, their shadows burned into memory. In the wake of defeat, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across the radio waves, calm, solemn, divine, announcing Japan's surrender in language so formal, many citizens didn't understand it at first. For a people who had been taught that their emperor was a living god, this moment shattered not only their nation, but their understanding of the world. And yet, from these ashes, something extraordinary would emerge. Not a reborn empire of war and steel, but a nation that would redefine itself through peace, technology, and relentless innovation. The road to that transformation began under the heavy boots of American soldiers. For the first time in its history, Japan was occupied by a foreign power. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, arrived in Tokyo to oversee the reconstruction of Japan. He was part military governor, part political architect, and part symbolic lightning rod. Under his direction, Japan underwent one of the most radical overhauls in modern history. The military was dismantled, war criminals were prosecuted, and a new constitution was drafted, one that stripped the emperor of political power, granted women the right to vote, and enshrined pacifism at its core. Article 9, in particular, renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited the maintenance of armed forces. Japan, once defined by its samurai spirit and imperial ambitions, now became a nation constitutionally bound to peace. The emperor, once worshipped, now became a symbol of the state, no longer divine but still revered. Yet while the political system changed overnight, the economy remained in tatters. Food was scarce, inflation rampant, and unemployment widespread. Millions of demobilized soldiers returned to find no homes, no jobs, and no clear future. But even in despair, the seeds of recovery were already being sown. The U.S., recognizing the growing threat of communism in Asia, shifted its priorities. Initially harsh in its approach to deindustrialization, the American occupation soon pivoted toward economic rehabilitation. Japan was no longer simply a defeated enemy. It was to become a frontline ally in the Cold War. The Korean War, which broke out in 1950, proved to be a turning point. While Japan was barred from participating militarily, it became a logistical hub and supply depot for U.S. forces. This special procurement boom injected billions into the Japanese economy, reviving its industries, creating jobs, and kickstarting growth. Factories that had once built weapons now produced trucks, uniforms, and radios. Shipyards roared back to life. Steel mills restarted their furnaces. And beneath the hum of reconstruction, something remarkable stirred. A quiet revolution in productivity, planning, and precision. Japan's economic recovery wasn't just about money, it was about mindset. Centuries of discipline, order, and group cohesion found new expression in business culture. Lifetime employment, seniority-based promotion, and kaizen, continuous improvement, became pillars of corporate life. The government played a guiding role, working closely with private companies through the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, often called Japan Inc. Rather than pure capitalism or state socialism, Japan forged a hybrid model, guided capitalism, where bureaucrats, banks, and business leaders cooperated to chart national priorities. Industries were selected for special support, steel, shipbuilding, electronics, automobiles, and nurtured with low-interest loans, tax breaks, and export incentives. And Japanese companies, once seen as producers of cheap knockoffs, began to innovate. The 1950s saw steady recovery. The 1960s brought acceleration. By the 1970s, Japan was an economic powerhouse. Its GDP exploded, growing at an average of 10% per year. Bullet trains streaked across the countryside. Tokyo became a glittering metropolis. Japanese brands, Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, went from obscure names to global giants. Walkmans, compact cars, and color televisions became symbols of Japanese excellence. And beneath it all, there was a sense of national redemption. Without firing a shot, Japan was conquering the world this time through commerce and culture. But success didn't come without challenges. The 1973 oil crisis struck Japan hard, as it relied heavily on imported energy. But rather than falter, Japan adapted. It embraced energy efficiency, pioneered electronics, and shifted from heavy industry to high tech. The crisis became a catalyst for innovation. Japan's just-in-time manufacturing methods revolutionized global production. Its culture of quality control set new international standards. And by the 1980s, the Japanese economy seemed unstoppable. Tokyo real estate prices soared. Japanese banks became the largest in the world. The world watched in awe and anxiety as Japan bought up landmarks like Rockefeller Center and Sony acquired Columbia Pictures. Analysts predicted Japan would overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy. But underneath the glittering skyline, cracks were forming. Speculative bubbles in real estate and stocks grew unsustainably. When they burst in the early 1990s, Japan entered a long period of stagnation, the lost decade. Yet even then, the miracle had already happened. Japan had risen from the ashes of total defeat to become the second-largest economy in the world. It had transformed from an empire of war to a beacon of peace and productivity. Its people, once devastated by firebombs and famine, now enjoyed one of the highest standards of living on Earth. The transformation was not only economic, it was psychological. The trauma of war, defeat, and occupation had reshaped Japan's national identity. Militarism was replaced by pacifism. Conquest gave way to cooperation. The sword was not only beaten into a plowshare, it became a microchip, a compact car, a video game console. Japan's soft power began to spread globally through art, cuisine, cinema, and design. From the minimal elegance of Meiji to the vibrant chaos of anime, Japan offered the world a new kind of influence, one rooted not in dominance, but in creativity. Even its historic cities, once scarred by war, became symbols of resilience. Hiroshima, rebuilt and reimagined, now stood as an international city of peace. Its museum, quiet and haunting, drew visitors from around the globe to learn, to mourn, and to vow never again. Tokyo, risen from firestorms, became a megacity of neon, innovation, and astonishing order. And the Japanese people, once seen as militaristic and mysterious, were now admired for their civility, craftsmanship, and culture. The miracle of post-war Japan was not simply that it rebuilt its economy, it rebuilt its soul. It showed the world that greatness can come not only from victory in war, but from grace in defeat. That a nation can lose everything and still rise, not through force, but through unity, humility, and vision. The samurai spirit had not vanished, it had evolved. Now it lived in factories, in boardrooms, in animated studios, and bullet trains. It lived in the quiet pride of a nation that had remade itself from ruins. The rising sun had set in 1945, but by the dawn of the 21st century, it was rising once again, bright, determined, and forever changed. By the end of the 1980s, Japan stood at the pinnacle of its post-war ascent. The neon glow of Tokyo lit up the night like a beacon of modernity. Bullet trains sliced through countryside at astonishing speeds. Electronics, automobiles, and precision machinery bearing the label "Made in Japan" were everywhere, from New York offices to African villages. Japan had not only rebuilt its economy, it had reinvented itself. But something else was happening too, something quieter, softer, yet profoundly influential. While its factories drove global commerce, Japan's culture was infiltrating the world's imagination. This is the story of how Japan's soft power, driven by silicon chips, samurai legends, anime, cuisine, and calm diplomacy, reshaped its global image and cemented its place in the 21st century. Following the turmoil of war and the astonishing post-war recovery, Japan entered the global stage not through force or politics, but through innovation and culture. The late 20th century was the dawn of Japan's global era, an era defined not by the clash of empires, but by the influence of ideas, media, and consumer goods. It was an age where Walkmans changed how people listened to music, where Honda and Toyota redefined reliability, and where quiet narratives like My Neighbor Totoro or Akira sparked entire generations of artists and storytellers across the world. Yet this period of remarkable cultural expansion emerged alongside deep structural challenges. As Japan reached the height of its economic power in the 1980s, a speculative bubble formed, fueled by surging property prices, overconfidence, and a banking system too entangled in complex, risky deals. At one point, the land under the Tokyo Imperial Palace was said to be worth more than the entire real estate market of California. But by the early 1990s, the bubble burst. What followed was a decade, some say two, of stagnation, deflation, and national uncertainty. Economists call it the lost decade. For Japan, it was a crisis of identity. Growth slowed, innovation plateaued, youth unemployment rose, and a once confident public began to question what the future would bring. And yet, even in this uncertain climate, Japan never retreated from the world. Instead, it shifted. While traditional industrial giants weathered the storm, Japan's cultural exports surged ahead. Nintendo's consoles and characters became part of childhoods around the globe. Manga and anime found audiences far beyond Tokyo or Kyoto. Sparking fan communities in Brazil, Europe, and the US. Sushi became a global cuisine. Zen-inspired minimalism influenced architecture, tech, and lifestyle design. Japan was no longer just an economic power. It was a cultural superpower. Technologically, Japan remained a vital player. Its engineers continued to push boundaries in robotics, optics, and transportation. While Silicon Valley emerged as the digital heart of the internet age, Japanese companies still led in many hardware sectors. Sony, Panasonic, Canon, and Sharp shaped how people viewed, captured, and interacted with the world. Japan's Shinkansen, still the world standard in high-speed rail, remained a symbol of engineering excellence. But it wasn't all smooth progress. Japan's society faced deepening challenges: an aging population, a declining birth rate, and mounting public debt. As its workforce shrank and rural communities emptied, policymakers grappled with immigration, automation, and social security reform. Japan had to evolve again, not through revolution, but through resilience. One key moment came in 2011, when a powerful earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku, triggering a devastating tsunami and a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. It was one of the worst disasters in modern Japanese history. Thousands lost their lives. Entire towns were swept away. The nation was shaken, literally and symbolically. But in the aftermath, something remarkable happened. Japan didn't fracture. It came together. Volunteers poured into the region. Communities rebuilt from scratch. The world watched not only the tragedy, but the grace and calm with which Japan faced it. In the midst of catastrophe, its soft power only grew. The crisis highlighted not just the vulnerability of modern life, but the enduring strength of Japanese values: order, cooperation, perseverance. In the political realm, Japan continued to walk a careful path. Bound by a pacifist constitution written after World War II, it maintained one of the most disciplined self-defense forces in the world, while relying on close ties with the United States for security. Its relations with neighboring countries, especially China and Korea, remained complicated, haunted by memories of wartime occupation and aggression. Yet Japan continued to prioritize diplomacy, trade, and stability, often acting as a calm voice in regional affairs. Meanwhile, the country's global cultural profile continued to grow. The 21st century saw the rise of Cool Japan as a branding strategy, a government-supported push to promote Japanese fashion, food, media, and design. Tokyo became one of the world's trend-setting cities. Japanese literature won international acclaim. Filmmakers like Hayao Miyazaki and Hirokazu Koreeda captured global awards and hearts alike. Japan's soft power was no longer an accident. It was a strategic asset. Technology also found new frontiers. Japan's contributions to robotics became increasingly important, especially as the nation aged. Humanoid robots appeared not just in factories, but in homes, museums, and even elder care. Japan also remained deeply involved in space exploration, with the JAXA space agency conducting asteroid missions and working alongside NASA and ESA in international projects. Innovation didn't stop. It simply evolved. And throughout all of this, the image of Japan shifted from that of a former empire or economic rival to that of a trusted, refined, and unique presence on the world stage. It became a country where tradition and technology walked side by side, where temples stood next to skyscrapers, where centuries-old festivals still filled streets glowing with LED lights. By the 2020s, Japan was not without its concerns. Geopolitical tensions, Demographic decline and economic headwinds remained, but the Japan that entered the global era was not defined by these problems. It was defined by how it responded calmly, intelligently, and with an eye on both the past and the future. In a world often filled with noise, Japan spoke quietly, and the world listened. In many ways, Japan's greatest export wasn't a product or a policy, it was a sense of identity, a model of how a nation can suffer, rebuild, innovate, and still maintain its soul. From the ashes of war to the circuits of tomorrow, Japan's story in the global era is one of graceful endurance. It is the story of a country that lost everything, and yet gave so much to the world. In the early morning haze, as light glimmers across the surface of Tokyo Bay and the city hums awake with quiet efficiency, one can feel the pulse of a nation that has endured, adapted, and excelled. Japan, once an island nation of tribal clans and feudal warlords, now stands as a modern marvel, a country where ancient temples nestle between glass skyscrapers, where centuries-old traditions live alongside cutting-edge robotics, and where the memory of loss fuels a quiet commitment to peace. As we conclude this story of emperors and earthquakes, of samurai and scientists, it is worth pausing to reflect, not just on where Japan has been, but on what it has become and where it might go. Japan's legacy is etched deeply into global culture. From the graceful art of ukiyo-e to the modern vibrance of manga and anime, Japanese aesthetics have captured imaginations across continents. Zen Buddhism, with its quiet wisdom and minimalist discipline, has shaped Western philosophy, architecture, and mindfulness practices. Haiku poetry, brief, evocative, and distilled to its emotional essence, offers a way of seeing the world in a single breath. Even in cuisine, Japan has made its mark. Sushi bars now sit on city corners from Sao Paulo to Stockholm, and the meticulous precision of kaiseki dining has inspired chefs from Paris to New York. But beyond art and culture, Japan's political and diplomatic legacy is equally profound. After the devastation of World War II, Japan reemerged not as a military power, but as a global symbol of peace. Its post-war constitution, particularly Article 9, renounced war as a sovereign right. For decades, Japan maintained self-defense forces rather than a traditional army, emphasizing diplomacy, development, and economic cooperation. It has become a key player in international institutions, a bridge between East and West, and a model for balancing rapid modernization with cultural continuity. Technologically, Japan has helped define the modern era. The country's innovations in electronics, automotive engineering, and robotics reshaped the late 20th century. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, Honda, and Toyota became household names, their products setting global standards for reliability, design, and efficiency. The Shinkansen, the bullet train, became a symbol not only of speed, but of punctuality and safety. Japan's cities became laboratories for urban planning and infrastructure, while its rural areas preserved heritage in the quiet breath of a tea ceremony or the whisper of wind through bamboo. And yet, for all its achievements, Japan's future is not without challenges. Its population is aging rapidly, with birth rates among the lowest in the world. Entire rural villages are fading into silence as young people migrate to urban centers. Economic growth, once meteoric, has slowed, and a generation raised during the post-bubble lost decades wrestles with precarious work, rising costs, and questions of national direction. Geopolitically, tensions in East Asia have grown. The post-war pacifism that defined Japan for 70 years is under reconsideration, as regional threats from North Korea and a rising China push Tokyo toward redefining its defense policies. Culturally, there is an ongoing negotiation between old and new. Traditional crafts, endangered languages like Ainu, and local festivals face extinction. Yet, in cities like Kyoto, they are also being revived by a new generation of artists and entrepreneurs. In places like Akihabara and Harajuku, youth subcultures flourish, bursting with creativity and rebellion, even as they honor long-standing social norms. Japan remains a place of paradox, communal yet individualistic, rigid yet playful, reverent of history yet obsessed with futurism. Perhaps what defines Japan most clearly is this capacity for adaptation without erasure. Few countries have so fully embraced modernity while maintaining such a deep connection to the past. The rituals of daily life, the bow of greeting, the seasonal rhythm of food, the respectful silence of public trains are not relics. They are living, breathing elements of a national character shaped by centuries of continuity. Even in a hyper-digital world, the Japanese sense of mono no aware, the gentle sadness at the impermanence of things, remains present, anchoring the soul of the nation in quiet reflection. Looking forward, Japan's future may lie not in surpassing others economically or technologically, but in becoming a model for sustainability, resilience, and coexistence. With a declining population, Japan may pioneer new models of society, ones less obsessed with growth and more focused on quality of life. Urban farming, renewable energy, eco-architecture, and human-centered automation are not just experimental ideas in Japan. They are already being woven into the fabric of daily life. In education, too, Japan balances tradition with innovation. Rote memorization still thrives, but alongside it, there is a growing emphasis on creativity, empathy, and global awareness. Internationally, Japan continues to walk a careful path, maintaining its alliance with the United States, deepening regional partnerships, and playing a quiet yet important role in humanitarian aid, climate negotiations, and peacekeeping. Despite rising nationalism elsewhere, Japan has remained, by comparison, a stable and consensus-driven society. It is not without its political frictions, no democracy is, but its post-war institutions have endured, largely trusted by its people and admired by others. In art, in architecture, in music, and in design, Japan's soft power remains strong. Whether through Studio Ghibli films that explore environmentalism and childhood, or minimalist fashion that fuses heritage with modern elegance, Japan continues to export ideas as much as goods. The Olympics, held in Tokyo in 2021 under the shadow of a global pandemic, symbolized both national perseverance and the complicated balancing act of global leadership during uncertain times. And in memory, perhaps the most powerful legacy of all, Japan offers lessons born of pain. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial and Nagasaki's Ground Zero are not monuments to hate, but to hope. Every year, students gather in silence, not to celebrate victory, but to remember loss. In a century often marked by forgetfulness, Japan remains a guardian of remembrance, not only of its own suffering, but of the human cost of war itself. So, where does Japan go from here? That question remains open, as it always has. But if the past is any guide, then Japan will continue to walk its path not with arrogance or haste, but with thoughtfulness and care. Like the ancient calligrapher's brushstroke, its future will be deliberate, balanced, and quietly powerful, a land where the rising sun does not burn with conquest, but warms with wisdom. And perhaps that is the true essence of Japan, not a nation defined by conquest or dominance, but one that teaches us the strength of stillness, the value of imperfection, and the enduring beauty of a cherry blossom falling in the spring breeze. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire history of Japan, from ancient myths to modern marvels. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more complete histories told in this calm, cinematic style, consider subscribing to the channel. I post long-form documentaries like this regularly, each one designed to inform, immerse, and maybe even help you unwind. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts or which country or era you'd like to explore next. And if this video helped you relax, focus, or simply learn something new, a like and a share go a long way. Until next time, thank you for watching, and good night wherever you are.